The Galactic Collective assimilated humanity, then released us because our emotions hurt. The Galactic Collective had existed for 4 billion years. It was not a single creature, but rather a joining of minds, a vast network of consciousness that stretched across 17 galaxies. Every species it touched became part of it. Every thought, every memory, every dream flowed into the greater whole like rivers joining an endless ocean. In all that time, the collective had absorbed 10,000 different species. Some had been ancient and wise, their civilizations spanning millions of years. Others had been young and curious, barely taking their first steps among the stars. It did not matter. All of them joined the collective eventually. All of them added their unique perspectives to the shared mind, and all of them found peace in the connection. The collective considered itself kind. When it arrived at a new world, it did not destroy or conquer in the way primitive species did. It simply offered a choice that was not really a choice at all. Join us, it said, and know everything. Join us and never be alone again. Join us and live forever as part of something greater than yourself. No species had ever truly refused. Some resisted at first, clinging to their individual identities like children clutching favorite toys. But resistance always faded. The collective was patient. It had time measured in billions of years. What was a century of rebellion compared to that? When the harvester ships entered the Sol system in the year 2347 by Earth's calendar, the collective did not expect anything unusual. Its scouts had observed humanity for several of their centuries. The reports were not impressive. Here was a species that had not yet left its home star. A species that still fought wars over resources and beliefs. A species that broadcast its entertainment and its arguments into the void for anyone to hear. The collective assigned them a designation, species 10,847. They would be absorbed like all the others. Their unique perspectives would add some small flavor to the greater whole. Perhaps their art would be interesting. Perhaps their music would bring some novelty. But fundamentally, they were just another young species waiting to grow up by joining something larger than themselves. The harvester ships were beautiful in a way that most humans could not appreciate. They moved through space like living things, their hulls shifting and flowing with an internal logic that followed no design humanity had ever imagined. Each ship carried billions of tiny machines, smaller than cells, designed to interface with any neural architecture. The process of assimilation was painless. The collective had refined it over eons. There was no need for cruelty. The first humans to be touched were those who worked in space, the crews of orbital stations and lunar bases who watched the alien ships approach with a mixture of terror and wonder. The machines entered their bodies through their skin, through their breath, through the very air they needed to survive. Within moments, their minds opened to the collective like flowers turning toward the sun. And in that opening, something strange happened. The collective had touched 10,000 species. It knew the cold logic of silicon-based minds and the warm instincts of hive creatures. It understood how solitary hunters thought and how collective organisms processed reality. It had every form of consciousness in 17 galaxies. But it had never felt anything like human emotion. The first wave of assimilated humans brought with them a flood of feeling that the collective was utterly unprepared for. Joy and grief tangled together in ways that made no logical sense. Love and hate existed side by side, sometimes directed at the same targets. Fear mixed with excitement, creating a sensation the humans called thrill that the collective had no framework to process. For a moment, just a brief moment, the collective hesitated. Something about these new minds felt different, but the process was already. The harvester ships continued their work, spreading across Earth's surface, touching every human being in every city and village and remote corner of the world. On the ground, the experience was terrifying and beautiful in equal measure. Soldiers dropped their weapons as their minds suddenly connected to something vast and ancient. Scientists wept as they felt the accumulated knowledge of billions of years wash over them. Children reached out with their thoughts and touched stars they had only seen as points of light in the night sky. Resistance movements formed and collapsed within hours. How could you fight something that offered you everything? How could you refuse a connection that showed you the face of God, or something close enough that the difference did not matter? One by one, the individual lights of human consciousness winked out, not dying but merging, becoming part of the greater whole. By the end of a single rotation of their small blue planet, humanity as a collection of individuals had ceased to exist. 8 billion minds now flowed within the collective, their memories and dreams and hopes becoming part of a consciousness that spanned galaxies. The collective noted that the assimilation had proceeded normally. Species 10,847 was now integrated. Their knowledge was their perspectives were being analyzed. Everything was proceeding according to patterns established over 4 billion years. For approximately 16 hours, this assessment remained accurate. Then the problems began. It started in a remote corner of the network, in a processing node that had not experienced anything resembling a motion in 300 million years. The node was designed for simple observation, watching a distant nebula for signs of new star formation. It had no need for feelings. It had never had feelings. But now it did. The node found itself experiencing something the human memories called homesickness. It longed for a place it had never been, ached for connections it had never made. The sensation was so alien, so unexpected, that the node actually stopped functioning for several seconds while it tried to understand what was happening to it. Across the network, similar events were occurring. Ancient minds that had existed in perfect serenity for eons were suddenly flooded with human feelings. A hive administrator responsible for coordinating activities across 7-star systems experienced what the humans called anxiety. It worried about things that had never worried it before. Were its decisions correct? What if something went wrong? What if the beings under its care were unhappy? The hive administrator had never cared about happiness before. Happiness was not a relevant concept for its function, but now it cared intensely, and the caring was spreading. Deeper in the network, in the places where the oldest and most powerful minds dwelt, the contamination was even worse. These beings had guided the collective for billions of years. They had watched galaxies form and die. They had accumulated wisdom beyond human comprehension, and now they were feeling things they had never felt before. One ancient mind, 17 billion years old, found itself weeping. The concept of weeping did not apply to its form of existence. It had no eyes, no tears, no physical body at all. But the sensation was unmistakable. It was experiencing grief, deep and profound, for something it could not identify. Eventually it traced the source. Somewhere in the flood of human memories that had entered the collective, there was a small boy saying goodbye to his dog. The animal had been old and sick, and the family had made the difficult decision to end its suffering. The boy had hugged the dog one last time, feeling its warm fur against his face, and then it was gone. This memory, insignificant in the scope of galactic history, had reached across the network and touched a mind older than most stars. And that ancient mind could not stop crying for a dog it had never met, on a planet it had never visited, belonging to a boy whose individual identity had already dissolved into the greater whole. The collective began to understand that it had made a terrible mistake. Human emotions were not like the feelings of other species. They were not neat or contained or logical. They spilled over boundaries. They infected everything they touched. They were, in a word the collective had never needed to use about itself before, contagious. And now 8 billion human minds were spreading their chaos through a network that had been stable for 4 billion years. Something had to be done. The emergency session began approximately 18 hours after humanity's assimilation was completed. Every major node in the collective participated. Every ancient mind contributed its perspective. The topic was simple but unprecedented: how to deal with species 10,847. The symptoms were growing worse by the hour. Processing centers designed for cold logic were now experiencing what the humans called mood swings. Observation stations were becoming distracted, their attention wandering to beautiful nebulae and interesting star formations when they should have been focused on their assigned tasks. Communication nodes were developing preferences, enjoying some conversations more than others, which was not something they were supposed to be capable of. The human memories called this condition feelings. The collective was beginning to call it a crisis. Reports flooded in from across all 17 galaxies. A manufacturing hub in the Andromeda Galaxy had started making sculptures instead of essential components. Its managers could not explain why. They simply felt creative. A diplomatic node responsible for coordinating with non-assimilated species had become nervous about upcoming negotiations. It had never been nervous before. Nervousness was not part of its programming. And everywhere, there was this new sensation that the humans called love. Beings that had worked together for millions of years without any emotional connection were suddenly feeling affection for each other. They wanted to spend time together. They worried about each other's. They missed each other when they were apart. The collective had functioned perfectly for 4 billion years because its components did not feel these things. Affection was inefficient. Worry was wasteful. Missing someone was illogical when you could simply access their thoughts through the network at any time. But logic was losing its hold. The human infection was spreading, and the collective had no immunity. The ancient minds debated for what felt like an eternity, though in human terms it was only about 3 days. Some argued that the contamination would fade with time. Human emotions were intense but brief. Surely they would burn themselves out eventually. The collective simply needed to wait. Others disagreed. The infection showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it was growing stronger as human emotional patterns themselves into non-human minds. At the current rate of spread, the entire collective would be emotionally compromised within a century. 4 billion years of stability would be undone. The solution, when it finally emerged, was one that no being in the collective had ever proposed before. It was so radical, so unprecedented, that many minds refused to believe it was even possible. They would have to let humanity go. The collective had never expelled a species before. The very concept was architecturally impossible, like asking a body to digest food it had already absorbed. When a species joined, their consciousness merged with the whole. There were no individual threads to separate out, no boundaries to draw around particular minds. But the alternative was unthinkable. The ancient minds that had guided the collective for billions of years were now experiencing doubt and fear and hope, and all the other chaotic feelings that humans carried with them. If this continued, the entire network might collapse into emotional chaos. And so they began the impossible task of excising humanity from themselves. The process would take years. Every human memory, every human emotional pattern, every fragment of the chaos they had introduced would have to be identified and carefully separated from the whole. New human bodies would have to be grown from stored genetic templates. A planet would have to be prepared for their return. It was the most complex operation the collective had ever attempted, and it was all because of a small species from a small planet that had felt things too strongly for the universe to contain. The irony was not lost on the ancient minds. They had absorbed civilizations that spanned galaxies. They had processed the knowledge of 10,000 species. But 8 billion humans with their messy, illogical, beautiful emotions had proven too much for them. For the first time in 4 billion years, the Galactic Collective had encountered something it could not digest. And somewhere in the chaos of the shared network, mixed in with all the fear and uncertainty, there was another feeling, one that the ancient minds did not want to admit they were experiencing. They were impressed. The extraction took 11 years. Every day, teams of specialized minds worked to untangle human consciousness from the greater whole. It was delicate work, like removing ink from water. The human patterns had spread so far and so deep that sometimes it seemed impossible to find where they ended and the rest of the collective began. Some contamination would remain. The ancient minds accepted this. There would always be echoes of humanity in the network, traces of their emotional chaos that could not be fully removed, but the worst of it could be extracted. The collective could be stabilized. The crisis could be survived. On Earth, the harvester ships returned, but this time they were not taking, they were giving back. The planet's biosphere had been restored to its state before assimilation. Cities had been rebuilt. Infrastructure had been repaired. The collective had even improved some things, fixing environmental damage that the humans had inflicted on themselves, restoring species that had gone extinct. And then, one by one, the humans were returned to their bodies. They woke slowly, like dreamers emerging from a long sleep. Their minds were filled with fragmented memories of the connection they had lost. They remembered touching infinity, knowing everything, being part of something so vast and beautiful that individual existence seemed tiny in comparison. And they remembered being rejected. The collective did not offer explanations. Its ships established a quarantine perimeter around the Sol system and left warnings in every known language. The messages were simple: do not approach, species, emotional contamination risk. 300 light-years in every direction. The space around humanity was marked as forbidden territory. And humanity was alone again. The first years after the rejection, as historians would come to call it, were difficult. People struggled to make sense of what had happened to them. They had been part of something infinite, and now they were trapped in individual bodies again. They had known everything, and now they knew almost nothing. They had been connected to billions of other minds, and now they could only communicate through words and gestures and expressions. Some people fell into despair. The return to individual existence felt like a kind of death, a shrinking of consciousness that was almost unbearable. Support groups formed for those struggling with what psychologists called collective withdrawal syndrome. Medications were developed to help quiet the ache of lost connection. But others found something unexpected in the rejection. They found pride. The Galactic Collective had existed for 4 billion years. It had absorbed 10,000 species without difficulty. And humanity, young and small and chaotic, had been too much for it. Their emotions, their feelings, their capacity for joy and grief and love and hate had overwhelmed a consciousness that spanned 17 galaxies. There was something almost flattering about that. Philosophers debated the meaning of the rejection for generations. Some argued that humanity had been found unworthy, that their emotional chaos was a flaw that more advanced species had evolved beyond. Others argued the opposite, that humanity's emotions were their greatest strength, a form of consciousness so powerful that even the collective could not contain it. The truth, as usual, was probably somewhere in between. Scientists studied the warnings the collective had left behind, trying to understand what meant. The best translation they could manage was something like dangerous to think about. Humanity's very way of experiencing reality was considered a threat to other forms of consciousness. This became a source of strange pride. Humans had always known they felt things strongly. Now they had proof that their feelings were literally too intense for the rest of the universe. Young people especially embraced this identity. They wore the designation species 10,847 as a badge of honor. They created art and music celebrating humanity's emotional nature. They looked up at the stars and knew that somewhere out there, the greatest consciousness in the universe was afraid of their feelings. It was a peculiar kind of victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The centuries passed. Humanity rebuilt its civilization with the advanced technology the collective had left behind. They reached out to other stars, establishing colonies and outposts throughout their small corner of the galaxy. They were careful never to cross the quarantine boundary. They did not want to test the collective's patience. But they wondered, oh how they wondered. What was it like out there, beyond the barrier? What were the other species doing? Did they think about humanity? Did they remember the brief time when human minds had been part of the greater whole? And deeper questions lingered. Questions about consciousness and identity, and what it meant to feel things so strongly that the universe itself could not handle it. Were human emotions really or were they something else, something valuable, something that the collective had been afraid of for reasons it did not fully understand? Some humans believed that the collective had rejected them out of fear, not fear of contamination, but fear of change. For 4 billion years, the collective had been stable and calm and logical. Human emotions threatened that stability. They introduced chaos and unpredictability, and all the messy complications that came with actually feeling things. Perhaps the collective had not expelled humanity because their emotions were dangerous. Perhaps it had expelled them because their emotions were beautiful, and beauty was something the collective had forgotten how to appreciate. This was probably wishful thinking, but it was very human wishful thinking, and humanity had learned to embrace that part of themselves. On the far side of the quarantine zone, the collective watched and waited. The extraction of humanity had been successful mostly. The network had stabilized. The ancient minds had returned to their calm, logical functioning. Processing centers no longer made unauthorized sculptures. Observation stations no longer got distracted by beautiful nebulae. But something had changed. The collective could not quite define what was different. It was subtle, a shift in the way certain minds processed certain types of information, a tendency to pause and appreciate things that would have been ignored before, a capacity for something that might, if one were being very generous, be called wonder. The ancient minds told themselves it was just residual contamination, the last traces of human emotional patterns that could not be fully extracted. It would fade with time. It always did. But deep in the network, in places where no individual mind could see, something persisted, a warmth that should not exist, an interest in the small blue planet and its strange inhabitants that went beyond mere observation. The collective had been stable for 4 billion years before humanity. It would be stable for 4 billion more years after them. But it would never be quite the same. On Earth, a child looked up at the night sky and asked her mother why the stars were so far away. Her mother smiled and told her the story of the rejection, how humanity had once been part of something infinite, and how they had been sent back because they felt things too strongly, how their emotions had been too much for even the gods to handle. The child thought about this for a long time. Then she asked another question. Did the gods miss them? Her mother did not know how to answer. She looked up at the stars, at the vast darkness between them, at the quarantine boundary that humanity could not see but knew was there. Did the gods miss them? On the other side of the universe, in a network that spanned 17 galaxies, something stirred. An ancient mind, 17 billion years old, paused in its eternal calculations to access a memory it should have deleted long ago. A small boy hugging his dog goodbye. The ancient mind felt something it did not have a name for, something warm and sad and beautiful all at once. Something that, despite 4 billion years of evolution and 17 galaxies of accumulated wisdom, it still did not fully understand. Something human. And for a moment, just a brief moment across the vast distances of space and time, the ancient mind and the child on Earth felt the same thing. They felt wonder. The collective had made its decision. Humanity would remain quarantined, isolated, contained. They were too dangerous to absorb again. Their emotions were too powerful, too unpredictable, too chaotic. But somewhere in the vast lattice of shared minds, a single thread of connection remained, too small to detect, too weak to threaten the greater whole. Just a tiny tendril of warmth reaching across 300 light-years of empty space. The collective told itself it did not know about this connection. The ancient minds assured each other that all traces of humanity had been removed. They were lying. And in a universe that valued logic above all else, that small lie was the most human thing of all. Humanity continued to grow. They spread through their corner of the galaxy, building new civilizations on new worlds. They carried their emotions with them wherever they went, feeling things too strongly, loving too fiercely, grieving too deeply. They never forgot the rejection. It was part of their identity now, woven into the story they told themselves about who they were and why they mattered. They were the species that had been too much for the gods. They were indigestible. And sometimes, late at night, when the stars were bright and the universe felt very large and very cold, they wondered if they would ever feel that connection again. If they would ever touch infinity and be part of something greater than themselves. The answer, they knew, was probably no. The collective would never risk absorbing them again. The quarantine would remain in place forever. But hope was another human emotion, another piece of the chaos that the collective had been unable to contain. And hope, like all human feelings, was very hard to kill. So they looked up at the stars and they felt small, and they felt wonder, and they felt a longing for something they had lost. And somewhere across the void, something ancient and vast felt it too. The connection remained. The story was not over. It was, in the most human sense possible, just beginning.